This is the best of the week on Relevant Radio.
Overcoming scrupulosity is our topic for the show today, and joining us as our spiritual director is Father Patrick Hyde. Father Patrick is a Dominican priest and the pastor of the St. Paul Catholic Center at Indiana University. Father Patrick, welcome back to The Inner Life. Thanks for taking the time to be with us today. Overcoming scrupulosity, I think we better start with really getting into what we're talking about here. So before we dive really deep into it, what are we talking about when we're talking about scrupulosity, particularly when applied to the Christian life?
There's a difference between, guilt or compunction of some kind and scrupulosity. Everyone who does something that's wrong or sinful should feel sorrow for their sin or their brokenness. And that should hopefully drive them to the sacrament of confession over time. However, scrupulosity is something more than that. Scrupulosity it's a spiritual and psychological state. So it hits on both our spiritual relationship with the Lord and with others, but also our psyche. It's a state where we erroneously believe I'm guilty of mortal sin and therefore seldom in a state of grace. It produces feelings of doubt, guilt, anxiety. It typically involves seeing mortal sin where there is only venial sin, obsessively focusing on possible or imaginary sins that may or may not be sinful at all, or looking at every little inclination that we have, whether that be toward good things or bad things, as potentially sinful. And so when we look at scrupulosity in the Christian life, it can be a real impediment toward our flourishing, and therefore needs to be something that we address in a timely manner, not only with a spiritual father in the sacrament of priest in the sacrament of confession and potentially in pastoral counseling, but even up to and including seeking out mental health care, because it can be caused by underlying mental illness.
Out of your experience as a priest, as a religious, as someone who has worked obviously with a number of people and heard, I'm assuming, a number of confessions as well, what do you think are some of the things spiritually that might give birth to something like scrupulosity? What is it that leads into it? I know that, as a convert to the Catholic faith, even before we entered the church, my wife and I would hear a lot about good old Catholic guilt, so to speak. And again, like you say, to differentiate between the guilt that we may feel for something that we have actually done wrong versus kind of seeing that we're doing everything wrong.
Well, I would say, Patrick, I think mentioning your own conversion is important here. I work on a college campus. This is my 8th year serving as a priest on a college campus. We deal with a lot of young people who either for the first time are coming to the Catholic faith or are having an awakening of their Catholic faith. Okay. And so as a part of that conversion for a lot of people, for most people, in fact, when we deepen our relationship with the Lord, we come to understand more clearly the wages of sin and the impact of sin on our life. We also start to try to figure out, okay, well, how do I grow in virtue? How do I take on these sins? But as part of a conversion process, scrupulosity sometimes will rear its head because we want to be close to Jesus. We desire to be one with him. We've known his love. We desire for that to be the state in which we live our entire life. And so we start to move closer and closer to Lord. And I think, frankly, a lot of it in those kinds of situations is an intellectual and a spiritual immaturity. We have to learn, right? Like, okay, yes, it is, certain things are mortal sins, but not everything is a mortal sin. For instance, sometimes people think, well, if I break any of the 10 commandments, therefore I'm in a state of mortal sin. Well, that's not really true. And so there needs to be a form of intellectual and spiritual formation that goes on. But on another side, we see people who are dealing with either some sort of traumatic experience in their life. They're dealing with issues of mental health, particularly people who either have been diagnosed or might be experiencing for the first time obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD, or depression. Scrupulosity can be a symptom, if you will. I'm not a medical professional, so I want to be careful in that. But it can be a manifestation of something along those lines, where if it comes up out of the blue in someone's life, that's different than part of a conversion process.
Okay. Good differentiation there, Father, and I appreciate that. And maybe it would be worthwhile just reminding our listeners of what needs to be present, the three elements of mortal sin, as long as you brought that up.
Yeah, so for a mortal sin, it has to be clearly defined by the church as a mortal sin. Okay, we have to, for us to be able to commit a mortal sin, it has to be defined as such by the revelation. We have to know that, and we have to freely choose that. So we have to know that this is a mortal sin, that this is going to affect my relationship with Jesus. And then we have to have the free capacity, the free will, and exercise that in order to do it. So for instance, sometimes people who are in addiction or in a state of mental unwellness, or they lack the freedom, the free will in order to commit that. It's still wrong, it's still terrible, but they're not as free as they once were, whereas someone who knows that it's wrong and has that use is committing a mortal sin. So when we look at mortal sin, I think it's important, and when I always, especially because in my context and as a priest on a college campus, we deal with a lot of people who may not have actually been to confession since their first confession, unfortunately. And so one of the things that I always go through with penitents to make sure if there are any mortal sins is the things that people would struggle with the most with regards to mortal sin are any sexual sin, so any use of our sexual gifts outside of marriage that's open to life, any sort of real hatred and animus toward another, a desire to do violence or actual violence against another, a refusal to forgive someone over a period of time. And when I say refusal to give, I mean like entrenched, I will not make any effort to forgive. There's a difference between that and like the initial hurt. Failure to go to Mass on holy days, on Sundays and holy days of obligation, and then the use of intoxicants to affect our use of free will. Those things are what most people, I would say, in terms of my experience as a priest in the confessional, would struggle with in terms of mortal sin. There are others, but those are the ones that people would most often come into contact with.
Well, Father, maybe we're even unaware that we're struggling with scrupulosity, but maybe there's things that we're wondering, maybe this is leading down a line of being overly scrupulous. What are some of the signs that you would say that might be popping up in people's lives that might be indicating that, maybe you are being a little overly scrupulous about this?
That's a great question, Patrick, because I think oftentimes these things, they become more and more of a problem when we don't address it. But I would say in practice, the categories that I've seen are when scruples arise over potential, so anything that you may be tempted with in your present or future, or past sins. So especially sins of a sexual, violent, or blasphemous nature. Right. So when we start to have those things come up again and again and again, or just the reality of our lives, especially as embodied souls, right, is that we have desires for relationships with others, and there's a sexual component to that. But if all of a sudden you're starting to think that, any sort of desire of a sexual nature, or any thought of hurting someone else or being hurt, or any thought against God's goodness, when we start to see those in our life repeatedly, that's a good time to really, especially in confession, to bring that to the Lord. Another thing where scrupulosity can kind of start to manifest itself is feeling unworthy of prayer. So stopping prayer practices, or the other extreme of this with scruples is going to an extreme of prayer practices. So thinking that you've got to pray, all these rosaries, chaplets, and spiritual things throughout the day. When there's a temptation toward either pushing away prayer, thinking I'm not worthy, or thinking that the only way for me to overcome this is through myriad nonstop different types of prayer. And the last thing I would say that in terms of where does this manifest itself, is my attitude toward the reception of the sacraments, particularly Holy Communion and confession. Do I feel like I went to confession yesterday, and because of some of the things that I've thought or felt or done that there's no way I can go to Holy Communion, or every time I go to Holy Communion, there's a question of, am I really worthy for this? And then the other thing would be either avoidance totally of the sacrament of confession for fear, or over-reliance on the sacrament of confession, going every day or multiple times a day. When you see those kinds of things in your life, if you feel like when you walk out of the confessional, you need to run back in there and confess 10 more sins, or you think that there's just no way that you can be forgiven, and so why even go? Those are ways that in the daily life of the believer that we can start to see, well, maybe there's a little bit of scrupulosity starting to percolate in my heart.
Yeah, great answer, Father. Thank you for that. And I may be wrong on this, but it seems to me that all of those situations in which you might be suspecting an influx of scrupulosity, if you will, in your own life, maybe becoming overly scrupulous in that way, really it starts to affect our understanding of who God is. And it does shift us into this realm of feeling a bit, I don't know, I suppose it would be a bit Pelagian in a sense, right? That we are actually earning the love of God. And there's something that, in detesting our own behavior, not necessarily a bad thing, but seeing that it is actually turning God against us. And that's really where it seems to get really troubling, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely. When St. Thomas Aquinas, the great Dominican theologian, when he writes about the virtue of hope, which is the trust, the confidence that we will be saved, we are salvageable, he talks about the two vices that oppose hope, because hope or virtue is always in the middle. And on one side, we have presumption, which is no matter what I do, I'm going to be saved. Doesn't really matter. Jesus' work is done. Therefore, I'm going to heaven. So my work doesn't really matter. On the other hand, we have despair, which is no matter what I do, I can't be saved. And so, the virtue of hope is a great way of going back to rooting that our salvation is worked out, and God desires to work out, as St. Paul says, our salvation with fear and trembling in the reality of our life. And so sometimes I think it can not only be a sign of my understanding of who God is too distant, too far from me, or an understanding of myself, I'm too broken, I'm too warped, there's no way God can love me, when in fact the incarnation, which of course we just celebrated at Christmas, is a reminder that God desires to save us in the midst of our humanity, in our broken humanity.
Yeah.
And it's such a beautiful and wonderful thing for us to meditate upon.
Let's go now to Barbara calling in from New Jersey. Good afternoon to you, Barbara. Welcome.
I have suffered with OCD and scrupulosity my entire life, and I'm just calling today basically to say, praise God that I am currently working with a psychiatrist that I trust, and I think the important thing is to find a priest who is knowledgeable about this and patient that I can trust, because unfortunately, some priests and doctors are very not helpful. But praise be to God, I'm currently working with a priest and a psychiatrist. Each individual has to find the right way for them. But Relevant Radio has also been very helpful, and praise God. I had a book come into my hands called The Mindful Catholic by Dr. Gregory Botero, who happened to be a guest on Drew Mariani's show one day. He has exercises in there that I have been working every single day to work on building trust in God. And that is so important, to focus on trusting God.
Well, Barbara, thank you so much for sharing that. Look at the impact on major aspects of your life. If scrupulosity is something that is affecting your family, your work, your school, if you're a student, your social life, if it's impacting one or multiple major aspects of your life in terms of changing the way you interact in those areas, to seek out professional help, because it's not something that we can necessarily address on our own. And you mentioned also, Barbara, thank you so much for talking about having a good priest. And I think it's one of the things that when I've worked with students who either have OCD or are struggling with scrupulosity, I encourage that they go to confession, and this may sound difficult or weird, no more than once a week, but preferably no more than once a month. Because when you're going so regularly, you can be feeding the beast. The other thing, too, that's a part of that, is to try to go to confession to the same confessor. So that, because obviously in the sacrament of confession, the seal of the sacrament is absolute, so the priest can't talk with you about that. But when you're going to the same priest repeatedly for confession, over time, in a way, he can get to know your heart, and Jesus can speak through the priest in a much more intimate way. And then another thing too is, if you're going through this, maybe the first step, the easiest step, even if a counselor maybe isn't financially in your abilities, or you're just not afraid of what to do, ask Father in confession if you can set up a time to meet with him, or to just reach out to Father. Recently at my Newman Center, I was working with someone who was in a really bad state with regard to scrupulosity, and it really took us having a sit-down conversation in my office over the course of, it was about a 2-hour conversation, and to really help this person take the steps necessary. And within a week or two, that person was taking those steps. But it also required of me, because we were able to have a conversation in the external forum, to see this person and to say, hey, I really don't think you should go to confession today because of what we talked about, to help you in your healing. So having a good priest, having a good counselor, and taking those steps is so important, and I'm grateful. Another thing too, you mentioned having a book. There's a book by, and he recently passed away very suddenly, but Dr. Kevin Boast, who was a clinical psychologist, and one of the things, it's called Scrupulosity, and it's a book that I've read, and it was very helpful in my pastoral work with this particular person. But it's a great way to kind of reframe, and especially if you're going through scrupulosity, to be able to go back in and say, okay, what are the steps that I can take? And this is from someone who has the psychological background that the vast majority of priests don't have.
Like what you just heard? Share it with your family and friends. And thanks for listening.